Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our discussion today on equity, inclusion, and diversity in collaboration with IMD Business School and SIX. My name is Hannah Wise. I'm a journalist and moderator, and I'm thrilled to be part of these conversations focusing on such an important topic. Now, today's discussion addresses what is most important when it comes to driving gender equality. Is it looking at data, for example, on one hand, or is it about fostering a more inclusive culture? And which one is going to give us results faster? In the end, potentially the real answer is a combination of both. What we do plan on doing today, or we endeavour to find out a little bit more. Now, of course, the business case for diversity has been researched for many, many years. We know that a diverse and inclusive business is one that is more profitable, that is more innovative, it's more able to win and retain clients, and potentially more important, it's more able to win and retain talent as well. But when it comes to measuring diversity data, what data are we actually looking at? How are we using that data? Are we publishing that data? And how does culture and an inclusive behaviour play into all of that? Well, I'm delighted to say that is what we're discussing today, and we have a wonderful panel lineup for you in order for us to have that discussion. Let me just introduce you to them before we get started. Anuradha Seth, hello to you. You are Senior Advisor for Women's Economic Empowerment, UN Women, and Global Coordinator of UN Women International Labour Organization Programme, promoting decent employment for women through inclusive growth strategies. David Bach is Dean of Innovation and Programmes at IMD. Marion Leslie is Head of Financial Information at SIX. And Silke Mies is joining us as Head of Wealth Planning for Switzerland and Germany from Julius Baer. Now, you'll have plenty of opportunity to put your questions to our panelists throughout the course of the discussion. I'll let you know how you can do that a little bit later. But let's kick things off with our keynote speech. And for that, I hand over now to Silke Mies. Silke, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannah. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Time Together. As Hannah mentioned, my name is Silke Mies, and I'm heading the wealth planning team at Julius Baer for Switzerland and Germany. I'm also married and have 2 children. Today, we will hear a lot about inclusion and diversity and how it impacts our daily lives. I know for myself that both professional and personal I have been confronted with that topic in the past. When I started my career more than 20 years ago, at that time at a Big 4 consulting company, inclusion and diversity was not a topic at all. Topics like gender pay gap or limited promotion to female employers were all around, but we had no data and no one really discussed that. Nowadays, the world has changed. And even that we are talking today and have this wonderful session, inclusion and diversity, shows that something has changed. But still, we look at the representation of women or other minorities in leading positions. Data shows us still today is an inequality. Finding our North Star in a world that is always changing will be crucial. As we know one thing based on data, that organizations make inclusion and diversity part of their strategy, internal or external, and out from those who don't. Before I come to my next slide to give you the view on onward and inward perspective and how we in Julius Baer see that, I want to share with you one figure in that respect from the banking sector, which I still wonder about. Until 1976, women were not allowed to open up a bank account in Switzerland without permission of their husband. So luckily, this has changed, and also many other things. When we in Julius Baer start with the client perspective, which is the outward perspective. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. We recognize that more and more clients of us nowadays want family members equally present in managing the private and the business wealth. A lot of our clients are entrepreneurs, and we also advise them in topics of family governance questions. Very often we confronted with question in the family, who will be the next CEO? Who will sit in the board of directors? Do we need a family council or family assembly? Which will take a role over? Our impression in Julius Baer is that even more and more female members participate, but also want to participate in the family business. Most families realized that a mixed family culture can bring different skills and perspectives. And also in respect of managing the assets with Julius Baer, we see that next generation women want to be part in meetings, and not only be part in meetings, but also want to play an active role in the decision progress. Not only in asset management, but also in other topics we offer Julius Baer, like sustainability or wealth planning. It's even that women ask for more services, how we can support them. When I come to the inward perspective, which is what are we doing internally in Julius Baer, I want to mention two initiatives which we recently introduced. The one is an internal initiative for our Julius Baer employees, and the other one is one for our female clients and female family members. When I start with the internal one, regarding the internal initiative, we provided a questionnaire to all female employees of Julius Baer Germany and asked them which financial topic you would be interested in most and where do you want to have more knowledge. The larger majority replied that we want to learn more about financial planning for women. What is special for women? What is different to financial planning for men? We launched a number of trainings based on a women's life circle that every woman in every age could participate and learn more. What have we done? We showed a life circle of a woman who just finished university. After university, she started with her first job. After the first job, there were questions about how should I plan my financial, how can I start to protect my assets. Also, later when she got married and got children, what are the trigger points she should think about? Very important also from a legal perspective. Do I need a prenup? I'm not married or I'm married. What are the difference and what are the important questions women also proactively have to raise in their family and also with their partners? Afterwards, there were trainings about divorce or then retirement. What should be the important topics I need to discuss in that age? It shows us, and also the feedback, and we will launch these sessions again, that the knowledge sharing was so important, and also that the women proactively discuss these topics either with their colleagues or with their family or partners. The other initiative we launched was an external with clients, with female clients or other female family members of our clients. We also launched a number of trainings globally in the area of wealth planning, sustainability, impact investment, and financial markets. After every training, we sent out questionnaires, what were the important topics and what you want to raise again or get some more insights. This was a couple of years ago, a pilot program, but we're still running it. And I'm proud that there are still more and more women who are interested in that. This shows, regardless of age and background, we need to keep educating both internally in the organizations, but also externally with clients, with other interested groups, to be able to benefit from the best available talent. With that, I want to thank you for your time. I want to hand over back to Hannah.
Thank you very much indeed, Silke. A real insight there into the changes that are taking place within wealth management, especially when it comes to women. We're very pleased to have you, Silke, as part of our panel discussion today. Of course, you'll be joining David Bach from IMD, Marion Leslie from SIX, and Anuradha Seth from UN Women. Now, if you would like to put a question, this is to our audience today, to any of our panelists, please feel free. You need to use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. Just type in your question, or perhaps you'd even like to type in your question and then say that you'd like to actually ask it yourself. Well, the floor is yours if you wish that. We're going to actually be dipping and crossing, in fact, over to Josephine Van Santen, who is Chief Equity, Inclusion and Diversity Officer at IMD Business School throughout the conversation. And Josephine, you'll bring us those questions as we go through. So let's kick things off. And I wanted to start with you, Anuradha. And looking at data in general when it comes to diversity, is data a good way to talk about gender inequalities?
Absolutely. I mean, without data, you can't really even begin a policy discussion with governments. Because now when you talk about any work that you're doing in terms of policy and programming, with your counterparts, and of course at the UN, our counterparts are member states, which are effectively governments and line ministries. You cannot have discussions on, what should be policy priorities on gender, on women's economic empowerment without making the business case for it. And that requires, in fact, the evidence and data.
What kind of data, Anuradha, is important data?
Well, so do I have the floor? Can I make my kind of interventions now?
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you for that. And thank you to IMD Lausanne for inviting me to this panel. I thought, since the focus of today's discussion is really on how data and evidence can be used to drive behavior change, and much of the discussion when I look at the panel is on how private sector actors do that, whether we're looking at the financial sector, banking, for instance, just now. I'm going to actually shift gears rather, and address this from the perspective of public policy. Because that's really our mandate at the UN. It's to support countries, develop, implement, and monitor national plans, policies, programs to promote inclusion. And in my specific context, it is to promote the inclusion of women in the labor market in decent employment conditions. So what I'd actually like to do is to consider two broad issues in this context, and to give an example of how we have used evidence to influence public policy that really addresses the exclusion of women from the labor market in developing countries. So let me actually begin by unpacking the issue, what we mean by behavior change in this context. Now, when you're working on public policy and you're working with governments and effectively with the institutions of governments, such as line ministries or the finance ministry, planning ministries, you're also working with very entrenched practices, with entrenched ways of doing things, from how policy consultations are held, to how policy priorities get decided, to how decisions are made in, government's budgetary allocation. So first of all, when you're advocating for policy change, you really need to go in with a business case with all of these relevant actors. And you can't do this without the evidence and the data, and that's what I started of saying. So for instance, we already know through labor force surveys, that's the evidence we use in this context, that many women tend to leave the labor market, or in fact don't even enter the labor market because of care responsibilities. Taking care of children, the elderly, the sick, infirm. And we know this because the evidence of time use surveys actually gives us this information. We've already documented the fact that women globally do 3 times as much unpaid care and domestic work as men. Now, when you look at the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on women and what's been happening to, gender equality, you're actually seeing a real inflection point here. What you've seen is that women's unpaid care responsibilities have been magnified manifold. So just to give an example, we've recently conducted research in 16 countries, which has shown that before the pandemic, women spent an average of 26 hours a week looking after children compared to 20 hours a week for men. And now this has risen by 5.2 hours for women. And as a result, the average woman now spends nearly the equivalent of a full-time job doing unpaid childcare, a full working day a week more than the average man.
So what you're pointing out here is very much that, I mean, you've really kind of described with some very explicit examples about what is happening and the inequalities out there. Perhaps I can bring in our other panelists at this point, Marian, Silke, David. What kind of diversity data are you looking at? Because we'll get into the nitty-gritty on what Anurad is saying a little bit later. But Marian, perhaps I can start with you. What kind of data are you measuring as a financial centre?
Thank you. So I think there are a number of indicators that are being measured and are incorporated into indices, gender equality indices, for example, but they are the ones that are publicly made available and in some countries required to be reported. So typically they tend to be, if we're talking about gender, number of women on the board, perhaps number of women on the executive, you might get total percentage of women in the workforce. Inside the organization, and actually in some countries you need to produce gender pay gap reporting. Inside the organization, clearly if you want to move the needle, you have to look at an awful lot more. And that can be basic things such as attrition rates, hiring rates, levels, and things like that. But again, these are still symptoms. And I think if you really want to get underneath what's happening, you have to track what's happening within the life cycle, as Silke said, the life cycle of an employee, male or female, and what are the cumulative micro happenings that actually result in these changes in career trajectory. So it could be, a number of projects involved in, times presented to the board, foreign trips, whatever it is, all these things add up to a greater or a lesser profile and a more greater likelihood to be promoted or to leave the organization. So I think there's the symptoms that we see outside, and then there's the reality that we see inside.
Isn't there a problem, though, that all of this data takes an awful long time to gather and to analyze and to present? David, what's your perspective on this?
So I think, data is very powerful, right? We have here at IMD, and of course, this is true for most business schools, we have a whole section of what we do, which is around, accounting and performance measurement, because we know that collecting data and sharing data, making it public, is so important in order to create accountability, to create trust with stakeholders. We've long known that for financial data, right? That's why exchanges require all kinds of disclosures, what governments require disclosures. We don't get progress and performance in the right direction without that. And so, I think a priori, my view certainly, and I think that of many of my colleagues, is that there's no reason why, when it comes to equity, inclusion, and diversity, this would be different. Now, what is different is that we haven't sufficiently converged on what data we need to collect. Definitions, very often some of that data is personal. A lot of organizations are quite protective of that data. That is sometimes because they know that the data doesn't perhaps paint the organization in the best picture, or that the organization or that the data isn't perhaps quite as favorable. And so I think what is really important is that on the one hand side, organizations collect internally the kind of data they need in order to support their diversity, equity, and inclusion journeys, to measure progress, but at the same time that we sort of externally, if you will, converge on a couple of indicators. That is why gender pay gap is so powerful. That is why Pay Equity Day is such an important milestone, right? It's a couple of simple data points that people can look at to, compare countries, perhaps to look at companies or to look at industries and get a sense. And so, they are reductionist by definition, but I think they play a really important role in holding organizations accountable and focusing the conversation on the inequities that still exist.
But I guess accountability can only come through transparency, and not everybody publishes or shares the data that they're collecting. Silke, I know that Julius Baer doesn't, for example, publish data. Why is that?
I think what is for Julius Baer important, and that's what I see. We are collecting data internally, but we take measures internally. As I described the examples, what we want to do, we want to give the employees the opportunity to have better knowledge, to get in better positions, to promote them. Of course, with that, what they are doing, it's more that we do not go externally with data, but we show measures internally. And that's on a constant way for the last years already.
So would you say that you prefer to focus on cultural behaviors and
exactly
inclusion?
Exactly, because that's at the end what will this is a journey, and we have to start at one point, but we have to focus on that internally. Not, of course, the data helps us in which direction we should go, but we have to take the measures day by day.
And Anuradha, what's your reaction to that? Do you see an importance for this cultural and behavior side of things as an important? Does it have an important role along with the data side?
Yeah, well, a couple of reflections. I mean, one, even when we talk about gender pay gaps, and that's very often been used as, a standard indicator for measuring gender inequality in the workplace. I still feel that the discussion, and if you're talking about behavior change, gets limited really to a small segment of women workers. And those are women who work in formal enterprises that are governed by those kinds of regulations. And I think we're leaving out hundreds and millions of women who actually work, at the bottom of the labor market and who work in informality. And how do you really address issues of equity and inclusion? Because if we're really talking about equity and inclusion, we need to be talking of the bottom of the pyramid as well. And I think that is why public policy is so fundamentally important in bringing about those transformative shifts and transformative changes. Which is why when we talk about women and women's employment in the labor market, we're really talking about, all kinds of women who come and are part of different aspects of the labor market. And so how do we address issues of equity and inclusion for those who are not governed by labor legislation? And I think that is where the role of public policy becomes really important in informing societal and behavior changes.
How much progress, though, Anu, is being made when it comes to public policy on gender?
Well, and that's, related to another issue you raised in terms of, well, how long does it take to bring about behavior change? You see, now when you're talking at the national level, of course, you're looking at a long outcomes. These are what we call outcomes, right? That you're hoping to get to, and they take a long time. But nonetheless, you have to use the evidence to make the case for this, right? And so I can give lots of examples of how we do this at the UN, where we're looking, for instance, we're working with 26 countries right now and making the case that, if a government, for instance, increased its investments in childcare infrastructure by a certain percentage of GDP, those are millions of new jobs that would be created, and how many of these jobs would go to women. So doing that would bring about a rebalancing also of unpaid care. That is a societal kind of change in the gender division of labor. So I think that's at least how we look at these issues, which are really quite complex.
David, do you think that we should, just following up on what you were saying earlier, should we standardize data that's issued, that's published, or data that's gathered?
Yes.
But who should lead that?
No, I mean, look, so again, I think Anuradha is absolutely right? So we have, there's so many different aspects of inequities that have to be tackled, and some of them lend themselves to the kind of data collection and standardization that we've been speaking about, and others do not. I think that's absolutely clear. I do think when it comes to addressing inequities, particularly in the labor market, I believe that there is in fact a pretty strong case to be made that standardizing a small number of important indicators, and we can discuss what they might be around representation on the board, or pay gaps, for example, or sort of the distribution of people across different sort of levels of the organization, right, might in fact make sense. Now, again, standardizing doesn't necessarily mean that governments have to do it. There's a lot of work being done by very important organizations to do these, organizations that come up with indices. We're seeing this very clearly now in the ESG space, for example. Of course, platforms such as Six, can play a role in incentivizing the use of some of these. I don't want to put Marian on the spot, but the idea here is that standardizing does not mean that we formalize as a matter of public policy, which might then lead to somewhat of a more rigid approach. But I think giving future employees, consumers, other stakeholders easily accessible and comparable data that gives them some meaningful information about what the state of gender equity is. We're talking now about gender, but we could extend this to the inclusion of people with disabilities, other types of minorities, for example. I think is valuable, because we know that organizations are increasingly concerned about their reputation. We know that future employees, particularly younger employees, millennials and Gen Z, are looking at a variety of indicators when they're making choices about where they want to apply. We know that consumers increasingly, and thank God, are not just looking at price and ease of access to a particular product and service, but they're also asking questions about who makes this, where is this made, what kind of an organization is this? And so you're basically addressing information asymmetries by requiring some kind of standardized disclosures around a couple of meaningful indicators. And we know that that is overall enhancing of welfare and ultimately of change.
And Marian, maybe I was going to ask you anyway, before David even mentioned you, however, can companies lead the way here?
Absolutely. So one thing we've done is launch a gender equality index, and as part of our environmental, social and governance series. So we've created indices based on the Swiss Stock Exchange, the SPI and the SPI equity and bond indices that allow investors and companies and shareholders to, if it's a company, they can rank their own performance on a consistent set of criteria. If you're an investor, you can choose to invest in greener or more sustainable organizations, and you can also choose to invest on the basis of equality, equity, and diversity. And I mean, unfortunately, we had to set the bar pretty low for the launch. So there's 100 companies in the SPI, and some have to qualify, right? So we've got 27 companies that qualify, and the qualification criteria was 20% of women on the board of directors and 15% of women on the executive. Now, if you look at what's happened in other countries, and yes, Switzerland has taken longer there was the example of women being able to open bank accounts, but the classic one is, since how long have they been able to vote? And you compare what's been happening on a legislation perspective, it's very different. So Norway back in as far as 2003 set the bar at 40% of women on the board, and we're not even able to get more than 27 listed companies that have 20% of women on the board. So we have a long way to go, but by pushing this out there, it makes notice. If you're a company, you want to be in that index. I've seen this happen, and we really truly believe that drives change, both as companies measure their own performance. As an employee, you want to work for an organization that is visibly good in this area. I've seen in other countries where the gender pay gap reporting has resulted in headhunters having trouble attracting women to companies who do not perform well on this metric. So it does drive change, and companies do take notice.
Well, perhaps now's a good time to hand over to Josephine van Santen. Josephine, what kind of questions are we getting from our audience tonight?
Thanks, Hannah. We have one very good question, and I'm just going to throw it back at you, and you can decide who gets to answer it. And the question is, what efforts are directed to increase participation of women in industries like construction and energy, and not necessarily in the traditional functional roles like finance, HR, marketing, but in profit and loss roles?
I think Anuradha, would you like to take that one? I know actually from my own experience, just living in Switzerland and having lived in the UK and France, I've never seen so many women in construction as I have here in Switzerland. So I don't know if that's anecdotal evidence there for you, but I mean, what is driving that? How can we get more women involved?
If I go back to the data, actually, one of the most entrenched inequalities in the labor market has been that of occupational and sectoral concentration of women. And in fact, it has been one of the sticky issues that feminist economists have, been looking and examining for a very, very long time. And there are factors that actually explain this, both from the demand side of the labor market as well as from the supply side. So I'll just, let it stay at that. But just to say, on one hand, there are many kinds of jobs where you have an employer bias, where employers don't consider women, fit for certain kinds of jobs. And we've seen that, for instance, in the STEM fields. You can have, the supply side constraints where women don't enter into STEM training because they already fear a disadvantage down the road. So, I mean, there are many different factors that explain a continued, but a very persistent occupational concentration and sectoral concentration of women in the labor market. And those are just the macro numbers. So surely we see, some changes and anecdotal kinds of shifts or, good examples here and there. But at the macro level, not much has changed at all. Not in 35 years, in fact.
Would everybody on the panel agree with that then?
I think the answer to all good questions is it depends. I think there are areas where it hardly shifted at all. I think there are differences by geography and by sector. And undoubtedly, I think government push does make a difference. I mean, I can see some areas of finance, for example, also traditionally male, where it has shifted a lot and others not so much. And it sometimes depends on the conditions, how the roles are presented, how they are conducted, what's expected of people. And all of those things can have a huge impact.
I mean, publishing diversity data has been role modeled by leading, Fortune 100 companies for a long time. Does the panel in general believe that that is the way to go moving forward to make these changes happen more quickly? Do you think that we should all be publishing data publicly?
If I may add something to this, and going back to the excellent question about the underrepresentation, in particular of women in certain sectors, I think that's also an opportunity to be clear about what some of the limits of data are, for example, because we know that, yes, we respond as humans to data. As Marianne said, everybody wants to be part of the index. Nobody wants to be at the bottom of the index. But we also know as humans that we respond to stories, to personal experience. You just spoke about, your observations around construction, for example. We know how important it is to see role models who come from the gender, the ethnicity, the religious community that you might come from. And so that is why so often the data is not moving, in part because we have these kind of chicken and egg problems. You have a lack of representation at the top, which sends signals about people from a certain background not having an opportunity or a chance in this sector or in this company. Therefore, they don't go, therefore change doesn't happen, and the data looks like it doesn't move. So really the answer to that question is it's the hard work of going the extra mile to make it so. So, and I know that so many probably who are connected are deeply involved in this work and know how hard this is. But you can throw up your hands and say, well, we have an underrepresentation of women in STEM fields. Or you can say, what are we going to do about this? How can leading enterprises encourage more women to pursue this through scholarships, through internships, through mentorship programs, and so on? How do we commit ourselves to quickly addressing a lack of diversity in our executive ranks, precisely so that we're sending a signal to women or underrepresented communities elsewhere in the organization that this is a place where they can rise, right? So it's important to look at the data, but it's also important to remember just how important it is to have role models, to have stories, to have experiences, both to inspire and at the same time to sort of get our attention around some of the inequities and the cruelty of the inequities that still very much exist.
I think this question really brings up the whole idea of data use and how we use this data going forward. And I think this is obviously a huge part of our discussion tonight. Marianne, you mentioned that you built an index based around this, to try and engender change. But how can data about underrepresented groups be used to better develop products in general? For example, Silke, I mean, you've used this data on women to create products for women, right?
Exactly. But I just want to, before I answer that question, I want to share a very interesting conversation I had a couple of weeks ago with a woman who would like to start working with Julius Baer. And when we talk about salary, it was not about the number we offered. It was the question she said is, I don't care. Can you promise me that this would be the same figure you would also pay to a male joiner in a junior position? And I found that very interesting, because this shows me that the employees today, they really want to know how this organization sees women, sees that if that is a serious topic, or is this just something which every organization says from an outside perspective, but not living inside. And I find that a very interesting conversation. That's why I want to share that in that panel as well.
Can I ask you what your answer was?
The answer. Thank you, Hannah. No, the answer was, and that's actually true, it would be the same.
Okay,
it would be the same. And just to be here open and transparent, this is something our HR department looks very carefully. Also, not only on junior position, only on senior position, that we have same equality if women or men.
And do you think it's HR departments that are really leading the way here within companies to standardize these things?
I think it is very important. In my keynote, I mentioned when I started working more than 20 years ago with a Big Four consultancy company, this was a big topic. There were a huge difference what a junior female would receive in respect to a male with the same education, same university, and we had big difference between that.
It's quite interesting hearing the stories of external data and internal data. Marion, yes, I mean, please jump in here. I was going to ask you anyway, you know, how transparent that link is between collecting data to design products like an index and the data that you're collecting internally.
Sorry, I had three questions in my head then all at once. On the products and services, I think marketing departments have been using this data very, very efficiently for years. And in fact, there was they know that women will pay more for a pink razor than men will pay for a blue one. And they've been exploiting that for a long, long time. So, you know, there's a lot of evidence about and actually I think there are laws against that now, but that's interesting. I was going to disagree, if that's okay with Silke, and I think HR departments are really important, that, you know, they have the access to the data and they can do the reporting and the analysis on the equity and access to all the sort of policies that make a difference. But actually, I think the thing that really makes the difference and encourages or makes an organization change is when the business leader is all in, and they're the ones that decide who gets hired. They're the ones that reject the short list or the long list from the recruitment agency. They're the ones that reject it 3 times over or sack the agency until they get the one that they want. They're the ones that decide who presents to the board, who shows up who speaks first at the away day, you know, all that stuff. That really makes a difference. So I think in order for the change to happen, it's the business leaders who need to factor it into every single conversation, decision. You know, how many people around their board table are diverse, and or their meeting table or whatever, who speaks first? How do they ensure that there's inclusion in the conversations? I think that's what makes the difference. And I've completely forgotten your question on the index, but that's very important too.
We'll come back to it. Josephine, I know there's questions from the audience.
Exactly. There is a question here about, is there data on the amount of women who apply for jobs versus the amount of women who are actually hired for jobs by function and industry and potentially by seniority? So let you again decide who to give that question to. And I want to remind the audience that you can put in your questions in the Q&A.
Absolutely. Anuradha, perhaps you can jump in here.
Yes, I mean, it depends, again, which countries. Some countries we have better data than in other countries. But yes, for the most part, you get data by sex, disaggregated by sex, by industry, sectoral classification, and sometimes it can go down to what we call a 4-digit level of an industrial classification, i.e., telling you in the plastics industry or sector, this is how many women work relative to men, etc. By seniority, I think that's very, very tricky because normally that's data kept by companies, so it all depends on whether they release it or not.
I can share one data point from my industry, which is education, and this is not for jobs, but I think it might still be helpful to illustrate. At this point, in selective US undergraduate institutions, over 60% of the applicants are women. There's sort of this sort of remarkable drop of male college applicants. And most colleges, at least the sort of very competitive colleges, are quite transparent about the fact that it is now harder for girls to get into colleges than boys, in part because they're trying to keep the lopsidedness to about 55% or so, in part because you have the possibility then of getting sort of escalating effects where then, you know, fewer women will apply and fewer men will apply to a place that is particularly lopsided. In postgraduate business schools and MBAs or executive MBA programs, it's the other way around. You know, we're working hard to move to its gender balanced classrooms. We're not yet there. Most of the top business schools, somewhere in the 40% range of women, but the percentage of women applicants is quite a bit lower than that. And you can draw some inferences from that. And I think that it's important to share that because it also, again, highlights Marian's point, which is, we're not slaves to the data and to the populations that we encounter. We have agency and we can make decisions about how we allocate scholarships and where we invest in mentoring and so on. And that is important, again, because we're doing this with an eye towards getting to a point where hopefully in the future we don't have to do it anymore because the populations that you draw from, that you recruit from, that you promote from are more equitable than the ones that we're perhaps currently encountering. And again, with this undergraduate experience or examples, it shows that it isn't entirely lopsided at the undergraduate level. It actually increasingly now cuts in the other direction, and admissions officers are beginning to try to take some corrective action there as well.
Given the lack, well, maybe I rephrase that. Is it possible for us to make change when it comes to gender diversity, inclusion, and equity? Is it possible to do that without the data? David?
I mean, I don't think so. Look, this is a cliche, and we say at least once a week here in business schools that you can't manage what you don't measure. So I think you cannot. But again, I think it's important for us to not lose sight of the fact that behind every number is a person. And so it can't just be about the data. In particular, again, I go back to Anuradha's point. There are things that we don't measure, and those things matter also. The situation of women for whom we don't capture labor market data, for example, they work just as hard or harder and are facing patterns of discrimination and so on. So absolutely, I think data matters a great deal. I think without data, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to make progress because you design policy around data, as Anuradha said, you set strategies within organizations. As we discussed, you leverage market forces, market of investors, market of employees, market of customers through data, but we have to be mindful also of the limitations of data.
And may I just very quickly come into second, I think, David's point about the limits to data. And I want to give the example of the UN itself, which is quite a notorious agency when it comes to looking at gender parity, especially at senior levels, and it mirrors very much, what you see in the broader labor market, right? As more women come into middle senior management, you start seeing kind of the drop off, certainly as they're headed into the senior most kind of roles, right? And it's a remarkable kind of drop off. So the UN for decades has been keeping records and tracking gender parity within the organization, and so that has been used as a monitoring tool. But so you have the data, and you use and you report on this every single year, but has that really made a change? And I think, it speaks to David's point on the limits to data. So what has actually made a shift within the UN, I would say, has been a lot of pressure from the outside. You've had scores. I mean, you just have to look at the last, well, it's not an election, but the selection of the SG. And if it hadn't been for a huge scrutiny on, getting more women candidates to also apply for the SG's post, that was pressure coming from the outside. So it points to the importance of data, but again, the limits of data really for affecting serious change, not just cosmetic change.
Josephine, I just noticed there's another question coming in, and a really great question. So maybe I can hand over to you.
So yeah, the question here came in just now. I noticed it at the same time as you did, Hannah. It's a fantastic question. I think it's for Marian. And the question here is, I look forward to the gender equality rating being launched, or the one that you launched at 6, and enabling the public to make decisions about where to workshop and invest. So would be wonderful to
So it is launched. It is launched. It's out there. and it highlights the companies that meet the criteria that we've used. We've got an independent partnership with an organization that collects the data and makes sure that it's normalized and standardized and fair. And you've got some companies in there that are not surprising. So Novartis, for example, and you've got some very small cantonal banks that are also doing an amazing job. So currently there's only 27 in the index, but we hope that that will soon change, particularly with the focus generally on sustainability, and that we'll be able to raise the bar. I should say and admit right here, so 6 isn't listed. And if we were, we would not make the index. And there was a discussion, well, are we brave enough to launch this, because someone will ask us, and what are we going to say? And I think it's pushing pressure on us too. So we also have our own targets. How are we going to, I mean, clearly we make the board, and we don't make it, but we have a plan. We're going to get there. But if we were listed, and we wouldn't be in it, and that would be kind of embarrassing, right? And that's exactly the kind of light that we need to shine on this. Admit no one's perfect. This is hard, but be honest about it and make the change.
I think it's quite interesting actually seeing, we've talked a lot about, what governments are doing, policy, and how much pressure that's putting on. We've talked about companies and transparency and how much they're doing themselves. But I love that question, because it's really about people voting with their feet, putting their money in the companies, investing their money in the companies, and really, choosing the hotels to sleep at or whatever it is by themselves. And this movement is also, I guess, gaining traction as well. I think we have another question, Josephine.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, because here the person asks, so a lot of companies ask today to fill in equal employment opportunity information on gender, sexual orientation, veteran status, ethnicity, race, and so forth. And so on the one hand, the person says, well, collecting the data is really good and purposeful and helpful. But there's also another side to it, which is, could there be a trend where applicants actually purposefully blind this type of survey to minimize a potential for discrimination?
Anuradha, perhaps you could jump in there.
I don't work for a company. I think, perhaps it's best taken up either by Silke or Marion.
But I feel like you would at least be able to tell us this idea about, are we sharing too much data? Is the data working against us?
There's always employer bias, right? I mean, and so sometimes you don't know whether, and these are things you've heard from people who often apply, people from minority backgrounds. Sometimes they don't know whether they should put their name down as an Anuradha or an Anna, for instance. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because people are very clued in to these kinds of employer biases, So what companies are doing to screen out employer bias is actually should be an important function of HR practices, for instance.
And there's an additional dimension of this, which is, again, by definition, data categorizes people, and we're all unique. We have multiple identities. There are very important discussions that are happening about how do you, particularly, again, and I'm more familiar with this in the US context, but also elsewhere, how do you actually capture data about race and ethnicity, for example? What do we do about the fact that many people consider themselves mixed race, for example. And on the one hand side, you have those of us who work with data, wanting data, clear data, being able to do longitudinal analysis, and therefore hoping that categories will remain somewhat stable. While at the same time, thankfully, we now understand that gender isn't binary, that race isn't necessarily discrete either. And so we have to be sensitive to the fact also that our interest in data gathering has to be somewhat tapered by the data subjects, the individuals having their unique identity, an identity that perhaps even changes over the course of their lives and their careers. And And, we can't expect them to nicely fit into the categories that we have come up with, whether that's companies or index creators or even policymakers.
Anuradha and David, thank you very much. Both very good points. Perhaps I can just leave one final word to Silke and to Marion as we wrap things up. What do you think, Marion, is the one thing that we can take home from this discussion and actually act on?
I think the point David made, actually, we all have agency in this, and I think the data is really important. I'm a huge data fan. It tells you where you are and whether you're making any inroads or not. But ultimately, worry less about the data in its aggregate and more about what you can do to influence it. I think that there's a huge, more than we think. I would say that.
And what about you, Silke? What's the one thing people can take home with them from the discussion tonight?
I think data, as David said, it's very important because we need them to take measures. For me, when I look in the bank sector, when I look at Julius Baer or other banks, and I look at the data, I think we have to start with the education, because if we do not change the education and give women the opportunity also in the banking sector to be successful, to have to build up a career, it will be difficult really to change data. And it is in our behavior, it is in our daily behavior that we can change that.
Thank you very much to all of you for taking part in this panel discussion. Silke Mies from Julius Baer, Marion Leslie from SIX, David Bach from IMD, also Josephine Van Santen from IMD Business School, and Anuradha Seth from UN Women. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all, and thank you so much to our audience for some really great pressing questions there, keeping us on our toes. Great session, and just to let you know that there will be some more content surrounding this session coming to you from IMD in the coming days and weeks, so do keep an eye out for that. But from all of us, thank you very much. Goodbye.
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 Bye.